The shot cracked through the air, sharp as a whip. The red apple exploded, fragments and juice spraying in all directions against the harsh afternoon light. For one suspended moment, time froze in Whispering Creek. The crowd's collective breath held, faces twisted in anticipation, dust motes hanging motionless in the golden slant of dying sunlight. But that moment was still hours away. The day had started differently. The morning sun cast long shadows across the main street of Whispering Creek, Arizona Territory. The year was 1876, and civilization here hung by a thread as thin as a spider's silk. Wooden buildings lined the dusty thoroughfare, their weather-beaten facades telling stories of harsh winters and unforgiving summers. The relentless wind carried grit that worked its way into clothing, food, and the creases of a man's face until it became part of him. Caleb Thorne sat alone at a corner table in the saloon, nursing a lukewarm coffee. His worn cavalry hat was pulled low, shadowing eyes that missed nothing. The scar that ran from his right temple down across his cheekbone to the edge of his jaw was livid in the morning light, an angry reminder of a past he couldn't quite remember, a past that haunted his every waking moment. At 65, he carried himself with the weight of 100 men, his shoulders permanently set, as if expecting a blow from behind. His hands, though gnarled and rough from years of hard living, moved with an unsettling precision when he lifted his cup. They were hands that had once held a rifle steady when a man's life hung in the balance of his aim. The war had given him that gift, deadly accuracy, but had taken so much more in return. It had left him a ghost, a drifter, a man without a home or a future. He'd ridden out to this dead-end town of redemption's folly, hoping to outrun the ghosts that followed him. He'd hoped the desolate emptiness of the place would finally grant him the quiet he craved, a peace that had been absent from his life since the war. He'd settled here 3 years ago, not because he liked it, but because it was the kind of place people came to be forgotten, the kind of place where a man could die with a few coins in his pocket, and no one would ask his name or mark his grave. The town was a miserable knot of broken promises and rusted dreams, its buildings half-rotted, its streets perpetually cloaked in a fine red dust that tasted of despair. He lived in a small shack on the outskirts, a place with a leaky roof and no windows, just a door he could bar against the world. He kept to himself, trading a little gold dust he panned from a nearby creek for supplies. Never staying in town longer than necessary, he drank his coffee alone, ate his meals alone, and in the rare moments when he spoke, it was only to his horse, a stoic roan mare named Mercy. Another? The barmaid's voice cut through his thoughts, a sharp, unwelcome sound that broke the rhythm of his solitude. Caleb shook his head. Much obliged, but I'm finished. He placed a coin on the table and rose to leave. Outside, he squinted against the harsh sunlight. His horse, Mercy, was hitched to the post outside the general store. He'd come to town reluctantly, only because his supplies had dwindled to nothing. The shack by the creek, a generous term for what was now little more than a muddy puddle, was isolated enough to keep people away, just how he preferred it. Out there, he only had to talk to Mercy, and the occasional ghost that visited him in nightmares. He was loading the last of his supplies when he heard it. The unmistakable sound of a mob forming, a low, angry murmur that rose and fell like a tide of human cruelty. Down the street, people were gathering outside the Red Mountain Saloon, their voices rising with a dangerous edge Caleb recognized all too well. Curiosity pulled at him, but instinct told him to mount up and ride out. He'd seen enough trouble for one lifetime. He'd learned the hard way that a man who involved himself in other people's fights was a man who'd never find peace. They caught one of them, Apache women, sneaking around the Mackenzie's property, said a voice behind him. Caleb turned to see the shopkeeper, Thompson, leaning in the doorway, wiping his hands on a dirty cloth. Sheriff's got her tied up outside the saloon. Folks are making a sport of it. Caleb's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He finished tying down his supplies and untethered his horse. Ain't your concern anyway, Thompson added with a shrug. Just a savage. Caleb's hand paused on the reins. The memories flickered, not of a woman, but of a boy. A young soldier, scared and alone, trapped in a moment of violence he couldn't escape. A decision made under duress, a loyalty misplaced, a life lost. He closed his eyes briefly, seeing again the brutal landscape of his past, the things men did when they believed no one who mattered was watching. A wave of nausea, cold and bitter, washed over him. The very air seemed to thicken with the stench of his long-buried failures. He was a ghost, a coward, a man who had ridden away when he should have stood his ground. He had spent a lifetime running from a past he couldn't remember, and the moment had finally caught up to him. Against his better judgment, against every single instinct that had kept him alive for decades, he led his horse toward the growing crowd. The throng had swelled to nearly 50 people, forming a loose circle outside the saloon. In the center stood a woman, hands bound behind her back, ankles secured with just enough rope to keep her upright but prevent any attempt at running. Her black hair fell in tangled waves past her shoulders, and though her dress was torn and dirty, she held her head high, her dark eyes burning with defiance. Sheriff Holden strutted around her like a rooster in a henyard, his silver star catching the sunlight. He was a big man with a drooping mustache and small, mean eyes. The kind of man who wore authority like a new suit, too tight and uncomfortable. Caught her trespassing on Mackenzie land, Holden announced to the crowd. Says she was just passing through, but we all know these savages. Always stealing, always lying. The crowd murmured their agreement. Caleb noticed the woman's eyes, how they scanned the faces not with fear, but with careful calculation. This wasn't someone caught by accident. She'd been searching for something. What she'd done besides walk on Mackenzie grass? Caleb found himself asking, his voice carrying across the suddenly quieter crowd. Holden's head snapped toward him. Recognition and something like hatred flashed across his face. Well, if it ain't the ghost himself. Hayes, thought you'd crawled off somewhere to die. Caleb didn't respond to the taunt. He simply repeated, "What crime?" "Trespassing's enough," Holden spat. "Mackenzie presses charges. That's all I need." Caleb's gaze shifted to the woman. Her eyes had locked onto him now, studying him with an unexpected intensity. There was something in that look. Recognition. It couldn't be. He was certain they'd never met. "So, what's all this then?" Caleb gestured to the circle, the ropes, the gathering crowd. "Seems excessive for trespassing." A man stepped forward from the crowd, Jasper Williams, who ran the livery. "We're having ourselves some entertainment before justice gets served." He held up a shiny silver dollar with a grin that showed his tobacco-stained teeth. "Whoever can shoot this off her pretty head gets to claim her. Sheriff says it's legal. Salvage rights, you might say." Laughter rippled through the crowd. The woman's expression didn't change, but Caleb saw her shoulders tense against the ropes. Holden chuckled. "What do you care, Hayes? You ain't shot at anything but bottles since you came back from the war. Lost your nerve, they say." Caleb felt the old darkness stirring inside him, the familiar shame, the sense of powerlessness. He watched as Jasper approached the woman and placed the silver dollar carefully on her head, making a show of adjusting it just right. She remained perfectly still, her gaze now fixed straight ahead, refusing to give them the satisfaction of her fear. "Step right up, gentlemen," Holden called. 10 paces, 1 shot. Hit the dollar, not the girl, unless you can't help yourself. More laughter. Uglier now. Winner gets himself an Indian woman. No questions asked. Caleb's hand had drifted to his holster without conscious thought. The Colt Army revolver rested there, worn smooth from years of use. He'd promised himself he wouldn't get involved in other people's troubles anymore. That path led only to more graves, more nightmares. But as he watched the first man step up, weaving slightly from morning whiskey, something shifted inside him. The woman's eyes flicked briefly toward Caleb, and in that split-second glance, he saw not just defiance, but a calm certainty, as if she'd been waiting for this moment. For him. "I'll take that shot," Caleb said, his voice cutting through the jeers and laughter. The crowd parted as he stepped forward. He could feel Holden's eyes boring into him, but he kept his focus on the woman, and the silver dollar perched precariously on her head. "Well, now," Holden drawled, "the ghost wants to play. 10 paces, Hayes. 1 shot." Caleb took his position, exactly 10 paces from the woman. Their eyes met again, and that same strange spark of recognition passed between them. She gave him the smallest nod, almost imperceptible. He drew his Colt slowly, feeling its familiar weight. The crowd fell silent. Caleb raised the gun, took careful aim, and exhaled slowly. The moment stretched like hot glass. The gun cracked. The silver dollar clattered to the dirt. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then cheers erupted, mixed with disappointed groans from those who'd hoped to see blood. Holden's face darkened with something close to fury. "Well," he said finally, "looks like she's yours, Hayes. Take your prize and get." Caleb holstered his weapon and walked toward the woman. When he reached her, instead of grabbing her arm, as she might have expected, he drew a knife from his belt and cut the ropes binding her wrists. She rubbed the raw skin there, watching him with those penetrating eyes. "Come on," he said quietly. She hesitated only a moment before following him through the crowd. People stepped back, some muttering, others laughing nervously. Caleb felt their eyes on his back as he led her to his horse. "Hayes," Holden's voice rang out behind him. "Don't forget who owns this town. Mackenzie won't be pleased. You're taking his property." Caleb turned slowly. "She's not property, and Mackenzie doesn't own me." He helped the woman onto his horse before mounting up behind her. He could feel the tension in her body, the careful way she held herself away from him despite their proximity. As they rode out of town, the whispers followed them like dust in their wake. No one knew he'd just made enemies of the most powerful men in the territory. But as the town receded behind them and the open country spread before them, he found he didn't much care. He wasn't running anymore. He was finally riding towards something. And for a man who had spent a lifetime running from nothing, that was everything. If you enjoy the story, hit that subscribe button right away. And if you don't, then just hit the like button anyway to keep more Wild West love stories coming. They rode in silence for nearly an hour, following the winding trail that led into the foothills. The woman sat rigid before him, never speaking, never looking back. Caleb kept his hands on the reins, careful not to touch her more than necessary. Finally, as the sun climbed toward noon, she spoke. "Why?" Her voice was low, with only the slightest accent coloring her perfect English. "Why? What do you want?" The bitterness in her question wasn't lost on him. In her experience, white men never helped without expecting something in return. "Not what you think," he said simply. "Not looking for gratitude or anything else." "Then why?" she persisted. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, considering. The truth was, he wasn't entirely sure himself. Something in her eyes, perhaps. Something that had stirred memories best left buried. The past had risen up to meet him in that dusty street, and he couldn't ride away from it this time. "Needed to sleep tonight," he said finally. "Couldn't have done that if I'd ridden away." She made a small sound, not quite a laugh, more a breath of disbelief. "You have many ghosts, then." "More than my share," Caleb replied. They fell silent again. The trail narrowed as it climbed, pine and juniper becoming more frequent as the elevation increased. The air cooled slightly, carrying the scent of resin and dry earth. "You have a name?" he asked eventually. She didn't answer immediately. He sensed her weighing how much to reveal. "Aiyana," she said finally. "Caleb Thorne." "I know who you are," she replied, so quietly he almost missed it. Before he could ask what she meant, she stiffened suddenly and made a small sound of pain. Caleb reined the horse to a stop. "You're hurt." "It's nothing," she said quickly. "We should continue." But when she turned slightly, he saw the dark stain spreading across the shoulder of her dress. "That's not nothing. We need to stop and look at that." "No," she insisted. "It can wait until we're farther from town." Caleb frowned, but nudged the horse forward again. She was right. They needed distance between themselves and Redemption's Folly. But the way she held herself now, slightly hunched to the right, told him the wound was worse than she admitted. They made camp as the sun began to dip toward the western horizon. Caleb chose a small clearing beside a stand of cottonwoods, far from the trail and sheltered from view. A trickle of water still ran through the rocky streamed nearby. Enough for their needs, if not much more. "Let me see that wound," he said as he helped her down from the horse. Aiyana backed away. "I can tend to it myself." "Suit yourself," Caleb said, turning to unsaddle his horse. "But infection's a hard way to die." He busied himself making camp, gathering wood for a small fire, and laying out his bedroll. From his saddlebags, he produced jerky and hardtack. Not much of a meal, but it would keep them going. When he glanced at Aiyana, she was sitting with her back against a tree, trying awkwardly to reach the wound on her shoulder. Without a word, Caleb fetched his canteen and a clean cloth from his pack. He approached her slowly, the way he might a skittish horse. "Let me help," he said, crouching beside her. "Then I'll leave you be." She studied his face, her dark eyes unreadable. Finally, she gave a small nod and turned slightly, pulling the torn fabric of her dress away from her shoulder. The wound was worse than he'd expected. An old injury reopened and badly infected. The skin around it was angry and swollen, with telltale red streaks beginning to spread outward. Caleb cleaned it as gently as he could, though she couldn't quite suppress a hiss when he probed the edges. "This isn't fresh," he said. "How long have you been carrying this?" 2 weeks, she admitted. It was healing, but the ropes, she trailed off. As Caleb worked, he noticed other scars across her upper back. Thin, precise lines that could only have been made deliberately. Someone had taken their time hurting her. The sight stirred something dark in his chest, a familiar anger he'd thought long buried. "These other marks," he said quietly. "Who did that to you?" Aiyana tensed. "That is not your concern." Caleb didn't press. He finished cleaning the wound, then retrieved a small tin from his pack. "Salva," he explained. "It'll help with infection." As he applied it, his fingers brushed against the edge of another scar. This one older, a raised ridge that disappeared beneath her clothing. She flinched at his touch. "Sorry," he murmured. When he'd finished, she pulled her dress back into place and moved away from him, putting distance between them again. "Thank you," she said stiffly. They ate in silence as darkness fell. The fire cast flickering shadows across the clearing, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its kin. Caleb watched Aiyana across the flames. She ate sparingly, her movements precise and contained. Her gaze frequently scanned the perimeter of their camp. "We should reach my cabin tomorrow," Caleb said. "You can rest there until you're healed enough to—" He trailed off, realizing he had no idea what her plans were. "Until what?" she asked, a challenge in her voice. "Until you decide what to do with me?" Caleb shook his head. "You're not mine to do anything with. When you're ready, you can go wherever you want." She studied him, clearly searching for the lie in his words. "The sheriff said I was yours now, your prize." "The sheriff's a fool," Caleb replied, "and I don't hold with owning people." Something shifted in her expression. Not quite trust, but perhaps a fraction less suspicion. "Then what do you want from me?" "Nothing," he said simply. "Just couldn't leave you there." Aiyana didn't respond, but she seemed to relax slightly. As the fire burned lower, Caleb added a few more sticks and settled back against his saddle. "You should sleep," he told her. "I'll keep watch." She hesitated, then nodded and wrapped herself in the blanket he'd offered earlier. She lay down, but Caleb noticed she positioned herself to keep both him and the perimeter of the camp in her line of sight. Even in sleep, she didn't intend to be vulnerable. As the night deepened, Caleb kept his vigil. The familiar weight of the Colt rested against his thigh, and his ears stayed tuned to the sounds of the wilderness around them. But it wasn't danger from outside that troubled his thoughts. It was what she'd said. "I know who you are." What did that mean? Had they met before? His memories of those years after the war were fragmented at best, shattered by the blow that had left him scarred and drifting. There were gaps he couldn't fill, names and faces lost to him. Could she be one of them? He studied her sleeping form, trying to place her in his broken past. Nothing came, but the certainty in her voice had been unmistakable. She knew him somehow, and whatever that knowledge was, it had made her wary, but not afraid. The night wore on. Eventually, Aiyana began to murmur in her sleep, words in her native tongue mixing with English phrases. "Blue Canyon" and "Ancestors' Water" repeated several times. Her body twitched, and a sheen of sweat appeared on her forehead, despite the cool night air. Caleb moved closer, concerned. Her skin was burning hot to the touch fever from the infected wound. He dampened a cloth with water from his canteen and placed it on her forehead. She stirred at his touch, her eyes fluttering open, unfocused and bright with fever. "Father," she whispered in English, "the soldiers are coming. We must hide the water path. Shh, Caleb soothed. You're safe. It's just a dream. Her gaze sharpened momentarily as she looked at him. Thorn, she murmured. You came back. I knew you would. Then her eyes slid closed again. Caleb sat beside her through the night, regularly changing the damp cloth on her forehead and occasionally offering water when she stirred. By dawn, her fever had broken, and she slept more peacefully. As the first light touched the eastern horizon, Caleb found himself studying her face. In sleep, the hard lines of suspicion had softened, revealing a woman perhaps younger than he'd first thought, early 30s at most. There was a strength in her features, in the proud line of her nose and the set of her jaw that spoke of someone who had endured much and refused to be broken by it. Who are you? He wondered. And how do you know me? When Aiyana woke fully, she seemed momentarily disoriented. Her hand went immediately to her shoulder, feeling the fresh bandage Caleb had applied during the night. Your fever broke before dawn, he told her, offering a cup of coffee. Wounds still angry, but the salve seems to be helping. She accepted the cup with a small nod of thanks. I said things in the night, she stated rather than asked. Some mostly native, some English. What did I say? Her gaze was intent, searching his face for any reaction. Caleb considered whether to tell her everything. You mentioned Blue Canyon and something about your father and soldiers coming. She looked away quickly, but not before he caught the flash of alarm in her eyes. Fever dreams, nothing more. They broke camp efficiently, and within the hour were back on the trail. Aiyana seemed stronger today, sitting straighter in the saddle, though Caleb noticed she still favored her injured shoulder. They rode in companionable silence, the rhythm of the horse's hooves, and the occasional call of a hawk, the only sounds breaking the morning stillness. By midday, they reached the ridge that overlooked Caleb's homestead. It wasn't much. A small cabin of hand-hewn logs nestled against the base of a rocky slope, a lean-to stable for his horse, and a corral where a few thin cattle grazed on the sparse vegetation. A narrow creek wound past the cabin, its banks lined with cottonwoods and willows that provided the only real green in the otherwise dusty landscape. Home, Caleb said, simply nudging the horse down the slope. Aiyana studied the cabin and its surroundings with careful attention. How long have you lived here? 5 years, give or take. Alone? Caleb nodded. Just me and the ghosts. As they approached the cabin, Aiyana tensed suddenly. Someone's been here. Caleb followed her gaze, but saw nothing unusual. What do you mean? She pointed to the ground near the cabin door. Footprints, not yours. The stride is shorter, and they're fresh. Caleb dismounted quickly, drawing his revolver. The tracks were, as she described. Someone with a shorter stride than his own had approached the cabin, circled it once, and then headed back toward the trail that led to town. Could be anyone, he said, though his instincts were now on high alert. Traveler looking for shelter, maybe. Or someone following us, Aiyana countered. Caleb checked the cabin carefully, but nothing seemed disturbed. His few possessions were where he'd left them, and there was no sign anyone had entered. Still, the knowledge that someone had been there while he was away set him on edge. We should be safe enough for now, he said, finally holstering his weapon. If Holden or Reed's men were coming for us, they wouldn't have left without waiting. Aiyana didn't seem convinced, but she followed him into the cabin. It was a simple space. One room with a stone fireplace at one end, a rough-hewn table and chairs in the center, and a narrow bed against the back wall. Shelves holding food stores and supplies lined one wall, and a few tools hung from pegs near the door. It's not much, Caleb said, suddenly aware of how sparse and unwelcoming it must appear. Aiyana glanced around, her expression unreadable. It has walls and a roof. That's more than many have. Caleb lit a fire in the hearth while Aiyana stood near the door, still clearly uncomfortable with her surroundings. You can take the bed, he told her. I'll sleep by the fire. She shook her head. I won't take your bed. Wasn't asking, Caleb replied. You're injured and need proper rest. Their eyes met in a brief battle of wills. Finally, Aiyana gave a small nod. Only until I'm healed. Then I'll go. Where? Caleb asked. The question seemed to catch her off guard. She looked away. That doesn't concern you. Fair enough, he conceded. He busied himself preparing a simple meal from his stores, beans, dried meat, and the last of his coffee. As they ate, he watched her from the corner of his eye. Despite her obvious exhaustion, she remained vigilant, her posture never fully relaxing. After they'd eaten, Caleb checked her wound again. The infection seemed to be receding, but the injury was still serious. "You need rest," he told her, "and clean clothes." He rummaged through his trunk and found a faded shirt. "It's not much, but it's clean." She accepted it with quiet thanks and waited until he stepped outside before changing. Caleb took his time tending to his horse and checking the cattle, giving her privacy. When he returned, she was sitting at the table, his shirt hanging loose on her smaller frame. She'd washed her face and combed her fingers through her long black hair. "Why were you really on Mackenzie's land?" Caleb asked, settling into the chair across from her. Aiyana's expression closed immediately. "I told you I was passing through." "Through to where?" "There's nothing out that way except more Mackenzie land and the old reservation." She met his gaze steadily. "Why did you help me?" The truth this time. Caleb considered deflecting again, but found he didn't have the energy for it. "When I saw you standing there with those men laughing," he trailed off, the memories rising unbidden. "During the war, I saw prisoners used for sport, men tied up, made to dance while bullets kicked up dust at their feet. Women." He stopped, unable to articulate the worst of what he'd witnessed. "And you did nothing then," Aiyana said, not a question, but a statement. "No," Caleb admitted, the old shame rising like bile. "I did nothing. Followed orders, kept my head down." He looked at his hands, calloused and weathered. "But those things don't leave you. They follow you into the night." Aiyana was silent for a long moment. "So I am your attempt at redemption?" The directness of her question struck him. "Maybe," he acknowledged, "or maybe I'm just tired of doing nothing when something needs doing." She seemed to accept this answer, or at least she didn't challenge it. "I should rest," she said, rising from the table. "I'll be outside if you need anything," Caleb replied. As darkness fell, he sat on the porch, smoking a cigarette and listening to the night sounds of the desert. The familiar routines of his solitary life had been disrupted, and he found himself unsettled by the presence of another person in his space after so long alone. Yet, there was something about Aiyana that didn't feel intrusive. She moved through his cabin with a quiet grace, touching things gently, respecting the boundaries of his life while carving out a small space for herself. She wasn't like the few travelers who had occasionally stopped by loud, demanding, full of questions and opinions. She understood silence in a way few people did, and she knew him somehow. The thought kept circling back. In her fever, she'd spoken to him as if to an old acquaintance, someone expected. "You came back. I knew you would." What did that mean? Caleb's memories of the years immediately after the war were fragmented at best. The blow that had left him scarred had also stolen pieces of his past, names, faces, entire months lost to the darkness. He'd been a cavalry scout. He knew that much. Had fought at Apache Pass and a dozen smaller engagements whose names he couldn't recall. Had received a commendation for bravery that now sat at the bottom of his trunk, tarnished and forgotten. But there were gaps, black spaces where memory should be. And sometimes in dreams he caught glimpses of things he couldn't place in his waking life. A burning village, children crying, a woman's voice speaking words he couldn't understand. The cigarette burned down to his fingers, jolting him from his thoughts. He flicked it into the dirt and rose, stretching his stiff muscles. Inside, he found Aiyana already asleep, curled on her side, facing the door, one hand tucked beneath the pillow. Likely holding a weapon, he guessed. Even in sleep, she was prepared to defend herself. Caleb spread his bedroll near the fire and laid down, his revolver within easy reach. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, the dreams followed. He was running through a canyon, the walls rising steep on either side. Gunfire echoed behind him, and somewhere ahead, a woman was calling his name. Not his surname, Thorne, but his given name, Caleb. The desperation in her voice drove him forward, though his legs felt leaden. The canyon narrowed, then widened into a clearing where a small pool of water gleamed in the moonlight. A figure knelt beside it, a woman with long black hair. She turned, and though her face remained in shadow, he knew her. Knew her and feared her, though he couldn't say why. "You came back," she said, her voice both relieved and accusatory. "I knew you would." Then the scene shifted. He was standing in a burning village, the smell of smoke and blood thick in the air. Bodies lay scattered among the flaming hogans. A child cried somewhere nearby. And standing before him was Jackson Jackdaw Reed, younger, wearing a cavalry uniform with sergeant stripes, his gun aimed at Caleb's head. If you like Wild West love stories or Wild West stories, drop a bunch of 1 second and your place in the comments for the Wild West Love channel. Tell me where you're listening from, so I don't feel so alone out here. The gunshot in his dream became the throb in his scar. Caleb jolted awake, hand on the Colt, breath caged in his chest. Dawn milked the cabin windows pale. Birds should have been stitching sound into the morning. Instead, there was a hush like fresh snow. Aiyana stood with her back to the wall, eyes angled toward the glass. She met his look and shook her head once careful, measured. "How many?" he whispered. "At least 3, she breathed. "They move like hunters, not drunks." He slid the carbine to his shoulder and ghosted to the rear door. "Back way, keep low, for the rocks." She gathered water, cartridges, a small sack of food in practiced motions. He eased the latch, flinched at its faint complaint, then let the desert's cool edge bite his cheeks. Nothing moved. Aiyana slipped first, a shadow unfastening itself from the wall. Caleb followed, staying in the seams of brush and stone. The first shot traced the air by his boot and kicked dust into his teeth. "Run," he said, turning to send 2 quick answers toward the scrub where the smoke curled. Bullets stitched the dirt behind them. They broke for the rocks, the slope pitching up, the light sharpening into a knife as the sun shouldered over the ridge. Aiyana's hand snagged his sleeve, dragged him lower behind a juniper, as a round rang off the stone above. "Good marks," Caleb muttered. "Too good for Holden's cattle." "You voe." "I told you," she said, voice steady despite the hammering in both their chests. Not ordinary men. 3 figures stepped into the open below, disciplined in the way they paused, scanned, signaled one tall, all angles and command, with 2 compact wolves at his flanks. The tall one's attention found them as if it had been walking there all along. He raised an arm, not a flourish, just a quiet verdict. There. Heat crawled up Caleb's spine. The tall silhouette pressed against a ragged memory moonlight on a black feather, orders shaped like traps, a voice as chill as creekstone. Jackdaw, Reed, Samuel. The name skittered through the broken rafters of his memory, and wouldn't quite land. Smoke rose from the cabin. Aiyana saw it first. Caleb turned and watched 5 years of solitude catch and bloom and fold in on themselves with an almost gentle inevitability. The roof sighed. Embers lifted like prayer. He waited for sorrow, and found instead a lightness close to indecent. "Caleb," Aiyana said, hand on his arm. "We keep moving." He nodded and swallowed the taste of ash. "There's a pass ahead. If we reach the high country, we can use the stone to wear them thin." They climbed, knees burning, lungs raw. The day strode into itself, the sun dragging thirst out of them, one mouthful at a time. The world narrowed to choices. This boulder, that crease of shade, the line of a bootprint gathering grit on a ledge. Below, the 3 shadows did not hurry and never lost the thread. By midday, they slid into a slit of a pass shouldered by sandstone cliffs. Wind funneled there, cool fingers in his sweat. "We're not rid of them," Caleb said, scanning the ravine. No birds, no lizards, just the old scrape of time on rock. "They're patient." Aiyana nodded and pushed on. She moved as if the land had taught her its grammar heel, where the stone would hold, palm where it would not, breath short and quiet in the thin shade. The creek in the valley had been reduced to a thread of brightness, then to dry teeth of cobble. Water in their skins sloshed with a mean little sound. A hawk rode a single loop in the white-hot sky and was gone. They rested in the hush of a stunted pine. Caleb studied her profile, the set of her jaw, the disciplined sweep of her gaze, the way weariness lived beside resolve without argument. "You know these ridges like a ledger," he said. "My people walked them before names were written on maps," she answered. "The land is a book, but it will not read itself to outsiders." "And Blue Canyon?" Her eyes flicked to him in a way. "Sacred, dangerous to those who come asking the wrong questions." She touched the pouch at her throat. Close now, you will see. They moved again, the corridor of stone tightening, turning, shouldering them into a serpentine path that felt less like travel than initiation. The air thinned and cooled, sound sharpened. At last, the stone released them into a chamber of light so sudden it felt like stepping into a bell struck clean. Blue Canyon opened walls banded in rust and slate, as if rain had learned to paint. The floor spread into a hidden garden of cottonwood shade, willow lace, and a spring bright as a blade. Water should not have been here, and yet it had been here longer than the story of men. The canyon breathed a slow, old breath. Caleb stopped with one palm open to the light, as if to prove it was making contact. "Beautiful," he said, the word smaller than the thing it pointed to. Aiyana's face changed, the way faces do when they recognize a hymn. She knelt and touched the spring fingers to water, to brow murmured syllables that sounded like the run of the stream itself. She waited, listening, as if the water answered. "The water path," she said at last, looking up at him. "It hides beneath the desert, feeds the places no map confesses. My father kept its songs and markers. The men who burned our homes wanted this more than gold, more than rails. With water, they own seasons, crops, people. Jackdaw knew it. Your brother knows it still. Oh." He tasted the iron of his own name. "Samuel," he said, saying it hurt less than not saying it. She rose and came closer, soft-soled on the sand. "You warned me that night," she said. "Whatever came after, you chose the right side and paid for it. The debt left is all of ours." He looked at his hands, at the white map of scar tissue, at the little black crescents of grit beneath each nail. For years he'd let the desert hold his sorrow like a bank holds a note. The interest had come due. "My cabin is cinders," he said. "Let the man I was burn with it." "It already has," she said. They drank the spring cold, the water shocking their mouths back into a kind of honesty. Aiyana led him to a bench of stone beneath a cottonwood and unpacked their small meal, jerky, hardtack, the arithmetic of survival. Between bites, she watched the mouth of the canyon. Calm did not mean careless. "Will they find this place?" Caleb asked. "They should not," she said. "The canyon folds itself to keep secrets. But a hunter who knows where water should be might guess where water is." He thought of the tall figure below them, the way the man's stillness moved other men like chess. He thought of blue bands in sandstone, and of a boyhood spent following a brother who never looked back to see if the smaller boots stumbled. "What happens tomorrow?" he asked. Aiyana considered, eyes on the spring, which never once looked like anything but the truth. "Tomorrow I show you what your scar kept," she said. "The marks my father left for those who can read them, the memory of where water goes. If you are to stand against your brother, you must remember the night he made you forget." Light climbed the walls and pooled above them in a domestic gold. Lizards dared the warm rock. Somewhere beyond the canyon's shoulder a lone shot cracked, or maybe a stone let go of its high idea and came down to join the rest. The sound did not repeat. Caleb cleaned his carbine with careful hands, not to pass time but to claim it. Aiyana gathered wood and built a modest fire that spoke in soft, sap-scented pops. When the flames were steady, she sat across from him and drew her blanket around her shoulders, a queen in a kingdom of silence. "You saved me twice," she said. "Once with a warning, once with a bullet. A third time waits." He nodded. "I won't fail it." They listened to the spring until the sound became as intimate as breath. Night shouldered in and gentled the scandal of day. Stars found the canyon's ragged rectangle and fitted themselves to it like stitches. "Rest," Aiyana said at last, her voice the same size as the dark. "Tomorrow we will walk inside the story the water keeps, and then you will know how to end this." Caleb lay down with his saddle for a pillow, and the colt within touch. The fire mapped his cheekbones in copper and shadow. The fatigue of the day unhooked itself one muscle at a time. When sleep came, it came without the old teeth. "Hey there, friend, take a moment and get yourself a full glass of water. It's easy to forget, but staying hydrated is crucial for your health. Also, if you've been sitting for a while, do a quick lap around the room and give your eyes a break from the screen. Your body will thank you." As night settled over Blue Canyon, firelight painted shifting gold across the stone walls. Caleb sat opposite Aiyana beneath the cottonwood, the spring murmuring behind them. For the first time since the escape, silence did not mean danger. "Now," she said, voice